Hello, my name is Mark Vernon, and this is the second in my talks on philosophy as awakening, trying to make the case that philosophy isn't just about dotting logical I's and crossing rational T's, nor is it just about therapeutic constellations in the modern world that sort of help us to make life feel a bit better. But that actually the ancient Greek philosophers aspired to nothing less than transforming our perception of reality, and so it's right to call it a kind of awakening. In the first one, I talked about Socrates and Plato in particular. And in this second talk, I want to turn to the Hellenistic period, the time in the ancient Greek world that came after Plato's death. We're talking about the second half of the 4th century BCE, and it's called the Hellenistic period because it follows the life of Alexander the Great, who came to power in Macedon on the north side of Greece, swept through much of the known world and demolished the old political consensus based largely around city-states, and opened up, therefore, communication, the exchange of ideas as well as goods and so on, right across the Mediterranean world, and then pushing towards modern-day India as well, the full extent of Alexander's conquests. And this very much changed philosophy. We now call it Hellenistic philosophy. It gave birth to the schools of philosophy we know as the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, the Cynics, and others. We'll focus on those four, and gave them a new flavour that took on from what Plato and Aristotle in particular had developed in response to the life of Socrates, and developed it in ways of awakening that in some ways are more our own even than Plato's was. And I hope to try and unpack some of that. So let's consider these schools one by one. They each respond to Socrates in a particular way. There's this kind of Socratic moment, you might say, where through either encountering Socrates directly or in the memories and the stories and tales and dialogues written about him after his death, people realised that they had to embrace life in a new way. There was a new sense of what it was to be an individual, and in particular there was this sense that what was me and not me, what was mortal divine, and what was known, what was unknown, kind of came into a much clearer perspective after the death of Socrates, and that rather than just approaching things through myth, it might also be possible to approach things through reason, through harmony, through ratio, through kind of tuning your own mind to the mind of the cosmos. And that was very much the task that the ancient Hellenistic schools took on in their particular ways. And I think what they each did, you can present it this way, is that they realised that in order to embark on this journey of awakening and your mind's being tuned more to the cosmos around, inner life matching outer life, you need a kind of entry point. You need a point of getting into your own life and then seeing how it does and doesn't align with cosmic life, the life of the gods and the life of nature. And each of the schools sort of took a different starting point and see where it took them, looked at where it took them. So in summary, and then we'll go through them one by one, but in summary, the Stoics began with emotional life, the emotional ups and downs. The Epicureans began with the way that human beings are pleasure seekers and pain avoiders, so the kind of pleasure nexus, you might say. The Sceptics looked at what we do and don't know, and saw that as the way into things, and what we do hold to be the case, what we don't know. And then the Cynics looked at nature and conventions, and they thought that the way that we live outside of nature through our social conventions, whether it be wearing clothes, using money, living in houses, all those kind of human conventions, they thought that is the place to begin. And if you find the right place to begin, then this takes you on this journey towards a new life, a new awakening. Another way of remembering this is that the Stoics weren't just stoical. there was something about emotion, but it wasn't about repressing emotion. It was about looking into emotion. The Epicureans weren't epicures in the sense that they thought more and more pleasure, the better. Actually, they thought sort of the opposite. Pleasure is an issue, but it's learning that less is more is the key to their beginnings of their philosophy. Skeptics weren't just skeptical in the modern sense of debunking other people's beliefs. Skepsis meant searcher or inquirer, so they would test themselves, in fact, to see where the boundaries of their unknown lay, and then what might lie beyond. And then the Cynics weren't just cynical. Cynic actually comes from the Greek word for dogs, probably, and dogs live without human conventions, so they were called the dogs and said, great, we'll call ourselves the dogs, because that's exactly what we're about, trying to live without human conventions. So I hope you can begin to get some sort of little mental map there, how each of the terms we use to describe them are a bit like what they're on about, but significantly different. So let me unpack that now, beginning with the Stoics. So the Stoics felt that the way into this new Socratic promise of life radically transformed was to think about the emotional hubbub of the everyday. They're called the Stoics, not because they're stoical, but because they taught in the Stoa, which was the Greek marketplace with the colonnades around, and they taught in those colonnades. And they thought that the marketplace was a good place to start to address emotional life, because in the marketplace every day you're confronted with the emotional ups and downs, the little annoyances, the little wins, bumping into someone you do or don't like, needing to get on, the stresses of time. There's a nice story told by an important Stoic, Epictetus, about queuing for cabbages in the marketplace, and he joined that queue because the cabbages were on cheap. But just as he got to the front of the queue, the cheap cabbages ran out. The market storeholder said, these are today's cabbages, not yesterday's. But this is the perfect moment. The cabbages run out, you get to the front of the queue. What do you feel? The Stoics ask. Do you get into a rage and complain at the storeholder? Do you go, oh, my life is always like this, my luck always runs out? Do you get worried about how much money you've got, that kind of thing? 100 different emotional responses come up when we're confronted with everyday situations like that. And they thought that these are really good points to get to know yourself and to get to know your emotional hubbub. And the point about doing that is that when you do, you gradually become less beholden to the emotional hubbub, the emotional ups and downs. Thinking about your emotions has this unexpected effect that it helps you to take a step back from your emotions as well. So you can develop a mind, have a mind about them. And it was that space, that spaciousness that can gradually open up when you pay attention to what's going on inside, that they were really after. Now, they were after it for a couple of reasons. One was a sort of immediate therapeutic reason, that in that space is a kind of stillness, they called it ataraxia, an imperturbability. And if you can live more from that place of stillness, rather than from the emotional ups and downs, the anger and not getting the right cabbage, your life will improve. You'll be less beholden to the emotional ups and downs, both of the everyday and then maybe even the big emotional ups and downs of life, life and death and loss. It might help you to negotiate those inevitabilities better as well. But also living out of this place of stillness becomes a new world, in fact. It's to be able to live in the world but sort of not completely of the world. And then something else comes through, they realise, something that you would never have expected, really, when you were just beholden to the emotional ups and downs. And they called it the logos, an awareness of the logos. Now, logos is one of these Greek words that can mean many different things. It can literally mean word, it can mean sort of argument, law, tendency, allure. Remember, a word like word wasn't just a sort of dead word, but to speak a word in the ancient world was to cause something to come into being. It was to perform, to have an action upon the world. Words had soul in the ancient word. They sort of did things as well as just described things. And logos was one of these very big words that for the Stoics, borrowing on pre-Socratic philosophers actually like Heraclitus, but for the Stoics, logos came to be the word they used to describe a kind of deep tendency or pulse that they realised ran through all things. It was in the human person, outside, in the natural world, in the cosmos itself. And what happens is that when you become disidentified with the emotional hubbub, the emotional ups and downs, and live more from the spacious stillness that is around that, you realise that there's another pulse on the outside of that, the pulse of the logos. And you can gradually align yourself not just with a kind of therapeutic stillness, but actually with a divine pulse that runs through all things. And the Stoic sage, the Stoic wise person, was the one who lived more and more in alignment with this logos, with this deep pulse. And so great Stoic sages didn't just sort of advocate the practical benefits of Stoicism, but they argued that we can become more and more conscious of the God within us. They talked about how we have seeds of the divine within us, and that if we can learn to dig deeply, we can come across springs of life that are never ending, that will constantly give us life. This is a remark that Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor Stoic, makes. Or alternatively, they would sing hymns to Zeus, who was kind of conceived of as a sort of high god, and give thanks to Zeus for the logos, for the pulse, for the way that human beings too can align themselves with the divine. We may not be like the great gods such as Zeus, but nonetheless we can know divine life, we can know of immortal life, even though we're mortal. So this was the heart of the kind of Stoic sense of awakening, to use practices that help you to take a step back from the emotional hubbub. That's the way in. You discover a kind of spacious stillness, and then moreover you discover divine life that you can share in too, even though you know yourself as a mortal. That's the full dream of the Stoic philosophy. Something about the Stoics. Now the Epicureans, contemporary with the Stoics, but they saw things a little bit differently. For them, the way into this new life, this new perception of things, promised by Socrates, was to think about pleasure and pain. They argue that there's one thing that's true about being human. It's that we are pleasure-seeking and pain-avoiding creatures. We'll do anything to have more pleasure and anything to have less pain. But much like the Stoics said, the emotional ups and downs will throw you all over the place. So the Epicureans said that pleasure and pain as ends in themselves, things to have or not have, will just leave your life sort of thrown all over the place. You become a sort of addict to pleasure or fearful of pain. So you've got to address that. Now, the way they thought we can do that is, unlike the Stoics, who said stay in the city because that provides the emotional ups and downs, the Epicureans said, no, cities are just kind of pleasure factories. They just lead to addictive lifestyles. You don't just want that olive oil, you want extra virgin fine olive oil like your neighbour has. You don't just want, as it were, water that's fallen out of the sky, you want water that's gathered from the Delphic hills. This is what cities do to us. So they argue that what you need to do is move out of the city, which they did, and the really committed Epicureans lived in places on the outskirts of the city in the farmland, which they called the garden. Epicureans lived in the garden, and this was a way of not being completely disconnected from human life, but to have enough distance so that you could start to find your own relationship to pleasure and pain, and not have it thrust upon you, as in city life. Gradually, what that could instill was a sense that you could take pleasure in small things. That, in a way, is the heart of their therapeutic philosophy, that by taking pleasure in small things, you learn to cope with when you haven't got what you thought you might want, and also when you have got it, you don't become addicted to it. You can enjoy it for what it is there and then, but sort of let it go when it comes. So take water, for example. Epicurus argued that there's a kind of natural free sort of water, the water that falls out of the sky. It's a great good. It tends to be easy to get, he said. So let that be your joy and pleasure in life. Don't worry about fancy water shipped in from elsewhere, which of course happens even more in the modern world. That just leaves you beholden to all sorts of contingencies in life that will give you pain if you then don't get the water that you want. Learn that less is more, that nature tends to provide good things, and that those things can be enjoyed really very profoundly. Epicurus said, I'm as happy as Zeus feasting on Mount Olympus when all I have is a glass of water and a barley cake, sort of, dried dry kind of bit of bread. There's a lot of pleasure in that, he said. And like the Stoics, though this isn't just a sort of therapy for everyday life, it takes you to deeper places. And it begins with the Epicureans, because what they notice is that some pleasures are what they called kinetic pleasures, that you have to do something to get them. So getting the glass of water is a kind of kinetic pleasure. But then there are also interior pleasures. They call them static pleasures. Friendship was a good one. Friendship is something which is easy to get, it's widely available, it's cheap, natural, and yet you can also carry around the remembrance of friendship within you. It's not just something that happens in external life, but happens in inner life as well. And in fact, Epicurus himself, some of his writings survive, and one of them is a letter that he wrote on the last day of his life, when he writes to a friend and said, even though I'm dying in an agonizing way, it's thought that he had probably kidney stones or bladder stones, he could remember their friendship and live from that stillness inside that their friendship represented, the pleasure that he carried inside, so that he could still call himself happy, even though he was dying in this pretty unpleasant way. He'd sort of realigned himself again with something inside. And later Epicureans, when they reflected upon Epicurus' life, they realised that this was really very remarkable, that not had he just realigned himself to the kind of interior of his own life, but he too had realigned himself to the interior of the cosmos. And so when it came to the Roman period, where the Epicureans were really greatly celebrated, Lucretius, the Roman poet, wrote a great poem on Epicureanism called On the Nature of Things, and he celebrates Epicurus there. He says his mind became free from the pleasures and pains of this world, and he could roam the cosmos, sort of see all things throughout the cosmic world, and return to show people like Lucretius and the first Epicureans how to live well. They thought he was a divine figure in that sense, that he had become to live, as it were, like the gods, in touch with the cosmos as a whole, because again of this turn inward, gained through pleasure and pain, and controlling that, realizing that less is more, and finding this kind of interior place where tremendous things, great wonders, could be discovered. You may, if you know anything about the Epicureans, know that they were materialists, that they thought all things were made up of little atoms, and that the world itself the cosmos itself was made up of little atoms. And then you might wonder, well, how does this sit with this kind of vision of enlightenment? Well, I think the thing to remember is that they weren't material atoms as we mean them. For example, the Epicureans thought there were spiritual atoms as well. These particles weren't so much sort of lumps of stuff like we tend to think of atoms. They were more like qualities. It was quite common in the ancient world to think of earth, fire, air and water not as elements as we might, but as qualities. And so that different aspects of life might take on a fiery nature, and then take on a watery nature, take on an earthy nature, take on an air nature. It was about, as it were, tuning in and out of the qualities of things. And so atoms too were more like kind of qualities. You might say they were kind of like spirits. Again, that's not a wholly satisfactory way of putting it, but they had a kind of vitality, a soulfulness, you might say. So that's how Lucretius could describe Epicurus still as a materialist and believing in these indivisible parts of nature, and yet his mind roaming free throughout the cosmos, because what his mind was doing was sharing in this spirited quality of the cosmos, as it were. It had become all fire and could then spread out throughout the cosmos. That was the Epicureans. They weren't quite as popular in the ancient world as the Stoics, but pretty much they became pretty popular too. No Epicurean emperors, as far as I know, but a great Roman poet like Lucretius was certainly an Epicurean. The third school, the Sceptics. Now, I said they weren't skeptical. Skepsis means searcher, and they actually regarded themselves as the nearest inheritors directly of Socrates. Remember Socrates had gone around asking, what's the nature of things? Do I really know what friendship is? Do I really know what courage is? Not because he was trying to pin it down, but because spiritually this took him to an edge, the edge of what he knew, and he realised that at an edge something new can emerge. So this is expansive of inner life, expansive of the soul. If you can tolerate the uncertainty, which many people couldn't when they bumped into Socrates, hence having him put to death, if you could tolerate it though, then life would grow. And the Skeptics turn this into a kind of method, a skepsis, a means of inquiry. A very nice image that comes out of the skeptical school that describes this is that they said life is like living on the edge of a circle. And inside the circle is what you know. Outside the circle is what you don't know. And the art of living is to live on the edge of the circle. And when you can have, as it were, one foot in a place that orientates you and one foot in a place that you're rather bewildered about, and that's a way of learning more and more. And so as the circle grows, as well, what you do know grows, but what you in contact with outside of the circle grows as well. That was the Skeptics. The founder of the skeptical school was a chap called Pyrrho. He, it's thought, actually travelled with Alexander the Great to India. And when he was in India, he came across the Hindu, perhaps Buddhist sages, and was very influenced by them. He realised that something had begun in his old home in Greece with the figure of Socrates. He then comes across these much ancient Indian philosophers, certainly the Hindus. The Buddha probably lived about the same time as Socrates as well, actually. So maybe in India at the time it was giving Indian philosophy a new lease of life, which Pyrrho came across. And then when he came back to Greece, he was sort of really challenged to try to develop a new school, and so saw that this edge of knowing and not knowing was the way to go. Sometimes it's known as Pyrionism, to sort of distinguish it from the method of skepticism, which just doubts for its own sake and thinks nothing can be true. Pyrionism is the more awakening approach to this philosophy. And again, if you can tolerate this sort of knowing and not knowing, not only is it therapeutic, because you don't worry so much about what you don't know and panic and try and stay in the comfort zone of life, but you find that something opens up. And in Pyrrho's case, what opens up, it seems, was actually really rather like Buddhism in India, in fact. Amongst some of the documents from early Pyrionism are ideas which seem very much like Buddhist ideas. So, for example, Pyrrho seems to have taught that when you look into the unknowns of life, you find it has three qualities. It has a quality of discontent, suffering, as it's often said in relation to Buddhism. It has a quality of impermanence. It's constantly turning, constantly changing. And the Pyrrhonists liked this because they thought, therefore, the exploration of life constantly goes on. It never comes to an end. It's constantly unfolding and discovering something new, impermanence. And then they also argued that much as we can't be sure about the world around us, so we can't really be sure about ourselves. And so this seems to correspond a bit to the Buddhist notion of having no fixed self, no permanent self. That too is moving. So sort of discontent, impermanence, and this no fixed self was in ancient Pyrrhonism, much like it seems to have been in ancient Buddhism. And this also, though, leads to a kind of sense of the ultimate in life, because beyond the impermanent, beyond the flux, can be perceived from time to time, what the Buddhists call the deathless. And this deathless zone seems to have a kind of quality of care about it. It sustains and even sort of wills well for all it is. Some of the artwork of Pyrrho shows him, for example, in the middle of a boat. And the boat set out to sea and discovered itself in the middle of a storm. And Pyrrho is in the middle of the boat, completely calm and happy, where the sailors around him are in panic about the storm. And I guess the message is that Pyrrho had discovered that inside, through the flux and turbulence of life, can be discovered a kind of a still place, a place where there's coming and going ceases, where likes and dislikes ceases, where what's known and what's not known ceases, and he was gradually able to live from that. So this was the Pyrrhonist version of enlightenment, different from the Stoics. They felt there was a pulse of life that they could get in the flow with, as their expression. Different a bit from the Epicureans, who felt that you could traverse the cosmos in your mind and see all things in that way. They felt there was it was a sort of more rarefied zone, actually, this place of the deathless, but nonetheless has these qualities of infinite never ceasing, always kind of sustaining, being there, and falling off into the ineffable like the other schools. So fourthly, when it comes to the Cynics, the Cynics known as the dogs, because they thought that it was human convention that caused human beings so many problems. They felt, for example, that we get flustered about what clothes we're wearing. We get flustered about what house to live in. We get flustered because we've got enough money in our pockets, and so they taught that by becoming unconnected to these human conventions and undetached from them, you not only therapeutically free yourself from many of the demands that otherwise fill the everyday, but again a new sense of life can come through. The founding cynic is known as Diogenes, and Diogenes famously lived in an upturned barrel. He just sort of ate the food that came his way. The story goes that one time he actually met Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world, meeting one of the most powerless. And Alexander thought he would try Diogenes out and said to Diogenes, I've got everything, what can I give you who have nothing? And Diogenes goes, do you mind stepping out of the sun? Because Alexander was casting a shadow across him. And that, do you mind stepping out of the sun? I think the story's remembered not just because it's kind of a good one, but because it gives you a sense of what the Cynics felt they could fall into when they gave up on these human conventions. And that was nature itself. I think they were kind of nature optimists. They believed that nature gives us what we need in life. And not just materially, you'll probably be able to find food, probably be able to get water, probably be able to find shelter. But that by becoming aligned to the kind of pulses, the patterns of the natural world, that too provides a kind of resting place, as well as a good attitude to have towards life. Now, the Cynic form of enlightenment gets taken up in perhaps an unexpected way, I think. Scholars argue about this, but I think it gets taken up in perhaps an unexpected way, which is in the Christian period. Because what happens as the Hellenistic centuries unfold, from about the middle of the 4th century up to the end of the 1st century, is that these schools sort of mix up together. Stoicism and Skepticism and Platonism mix up together quite a lot. Cynics tend to always be on the outside, like prophets kind of speaking in. There's lots of individual cynics mentioned rather than great schools of cynicism. And this sort of a mix of philosophy schools and ideas gets caught up into the early Christian period, where you might say the Christians have a new Socrates in the person of Jesus, where the old Socrates, now 400 years previously, had been a chap who lived a life that prompted everyone to think about who they were in a slightly different way. So too the same seems to have happened to at least some people in the case of Jesus. He caused them to sort of rethink life. And Jesus, I reckon, was probably quite influenced by the Cynics. If the Bible is right, he lived in the town of Nazareth. And Nazareth is just a 20-minute walk from the great Greek city of his time, of Sepphoris. Probably likely that he worked there as a young man, and we now know that Sepphoris wasn't just a sort of burgeoning Roman city, but was deeply committed to a lot of Greek ideas. The theatre, for example, has been excavated, and it's found to have been put together on Vitruvian, Pythagorean lines. And if Jesus was a carpenter, worked in the theatre putting it up, he would have been instilled with a lot of these Greek ideas, as well as his Jewishness, of course, as well. Hellenistic Judaism was quite a mix of Greek ideas and Jewish ideas by this time as well. And you get a sense of this when it comes through, when Jesus makes comments like, for example, consider the birds of the air, consider the lilies of the field. Are they not dressed in more splendour than Solomon in all his glory? This is a quintessentially kind of cynic remark that nature provides, and if we can give no thought for the morrow, then how much better is today? You see that in Jesus' teaching, and he was probably an itinerant prophet. The Cynics too were itinerants wandering around. You can imagine the young Jesus bumping into some old cynic sage in Sepphoris and hearing these thoughts about not worrying about tomorrow, and realising that just wasn't a sort of good therapeutic idea, but you would live in a very, very different way if you could actually do that. So it was part of what kind of inspired him. I think the other philosophy schools certainly inspired the first Christians, if not Jesus directly, and in particular the Stoics. If you know anything about the Gospels as well, you'll know that John's Gospel begins, "In the beginning was the Word," logos, the pulse, as it were, that the Stoics had perceived. The first Christians thought had become incarnate in the person of Jesus, and so a lot of Stoic ideas get swept up into the Christian dispensation in that way as well. And in fact, a lot of the reason why Stoics like Epictetus survive is because Epictetus' books were copied by the early Christians, and they used Stoic practices as a kind of Christianity 101 to take a step back from the emotions, begin to realise the Logos within, the Christ within, take on the mind of Christ. St. Paul, key in the development of Christianity, he too, I think, drew heavily on a lot of these older ideas of philosophy as awakening. His town, Tarsus, was a major city around the Mediterranean world. Not quite as much learning as Athens and Alexandria, but nonetheless would have been full of the insights of the ancient philosophers. And Paul actually quotes ancient Stoic philosophers. If the Acts of the Apostles is right, he says that God is the person in whom we live and move and have our being, the Logos in whom we live and move and have our being. This was from the Stoics' idea. He uses words like cosmopolitan, the idea that we're citizens of the cosmos. That's what awakening can give you, rather than, say, being Jews or being Greeks, being Romans, being male and being female. These divisions fall down for Paul as he awakens to realise that he's a citizen of the cosmos, as the Stoics have been intimating as well. So I hope that gives you some sense of how the Hellenistic philosophy schools took on this project of not just philosophy as a good idea, not just as rational argument, not even as sort of therapeutic hints and nudges about how to live better, not be so worried about emotion, and not be so worried about doubt, but that when you go on this therapeutic journey, something else opens up, a side of life that you just had no perception of before, perhaps because you were so caught up in that which is more immediate. And although they differ in their sense of it, and certainly how they talk about it, they don't doubt that there is a bigger life to be connected to. And their invitation, which was then taken up by the early Christians, was to step out into this way of life too, and to see what you yourself could discover, you yourself could know, could have direct awareness of. So the life just didn't go better day by day, but it felt itself to be grounded and rooted in that in which we live and move and have our being.